Welcome back to Explore Adventure Moto. My name's Travis. Today we're talking about suspension and what all those fancy doodads are and what they do for you. I've been around motorcycles and mountain bikes for a very long time. I've done a lot of my own adjustments, but I still don't know when it comes to this stuff. So I brought in an expert to talk to you guys today.
My name is Paul Sussbauer, and I own EVO Suspension out here in Forest Grove, Oregon. We tune and service dirt bike suspension as well as dual sports and adventure bikes. I would say, first and foremost, when you get a bike, figure out what you're going to do with it. So, as an example, you've bought a KTM 500. I'm going to say the 500 because it's a very versatile bike. Are you going to dual sport it? Are you going to race it? Is it a desert racer? Is it a woods racer? What are you going to do with the bike? Once you've determined that, kind of determines where you want to go suspension wise. So first and foremost, your best money spent is getting the proper springs for your weight. An oversprung bike may feel too stiff, an undersprung bike may feel too soft. Now soft sometimes isn't a good thing. What that can translate to is the bike rides too low in the stroke and now you actually have a very harsh ride. Typically with modern suspension, so shim stack style suspension you'd find on most enduro bikes and a lot of adventure bikes, most of them run 5-weight oil. Typically messing with oil weight was on older style dampening rod forks, and that would change basically the dampening characteristics, whether it be compression or rebound. And the reason for changing oil weights was the oil's flowing through the dampening rod, and it's literally like having a straw in a milkshake. By having a thicker milkshake or a thinner milkshake changes how well everything flows. So when somebody comes to me, in addition to just having a good conversation, I have you fill out this little writer form. The writer form serves a couple purposes. One, it serves as a record for what bike you have, some specifics about you, like your height, your weight, how much gear you ride, and then it has a section on different preferences. So do you stand up a lot? Do you sit down a lot? Or do you sit forward? Do you sit back? And then I also have like preferences. Do you like it a little lively, or do you like it just kind of feeling like a 1976 Cadillac sort of deal? I have people fill out this form. You can do a paper form, or I have it editable, so you can just do it right on a computer and email it right back. And one thing to note when you're filling out this form or you're having a conversation with me is be very honest and realistic with what you're going to do with the bike as well as your skill set, because a badly set up bike isn't going to do you any justice. And the other thing to keep in mind is I'm only as good as the information you give me. So if you tell me you're an A-level rider and you're realistically a C-level rider, you're going to get a bike that just isn't going to be optimized for you. Or if you say you're going to run desert and I set it up for woods, again, it's not set up for what you're doing with the bike. So when it comes to adventure bikes and dual sports, one of the things I'll ask you is, how much luggage are you carrying? And how often are you carrying that luggage? And a lot of that is kind of coming back to how I'm going to spring the bike. For guys that are running a lot of camping gear all the time on their big adventure bike, because maybe that's what they do most of the time, I'm probably going to spring that rear a little bit heavier. Or, if it's a bike you kind of do 50-50. Half the time you're on day trips where your bike's kind of empty, and half the time it's, multi-day trips where you are loaded for bear. I'm going to kind of spring in the middle, and then most bikes do have some kind of preload adjustment. Usually in the case of the bigger bikes, it's an adjustable knob. Like this is a T7 shock where we can actually adjust the spring preload very quickly and easily. So depending on what you're doing for the day, ramp it up or ramp it down. Sometimes people say, well, is my bike oversprung for when it's empty? Technically, yes, but by backing off the preload a little bit, you'll actually get an overall plusher ride. So we have linear springs and we have progressive springs. So linear springs, they are the same stiffness throughout the whole stroke of the spring. A progressive spring has several different rates built into the spring itself. You can see how the coils are spaced out a little further, and then as it gets closer here, they get the actual coils themselves are spaced a little closer. What this does is you can run a little bit softer spring at kind of the top of the stroke, so it's a little more plush. but then as the suspension compresses, it gets a little bit stiffer, and so now you have less tendency to bottom out. Progressive springs are nice for a lot of the older style dampening rod forks, where unless you do a bunch of other modifications to the forks themselves, this kind of helps prevent bottoming but still maintains that plushness. Some of the adventure bikes, especially in the case of the rear shock spring, is kind of nice because, again, you can have the top of the stroke being kind of nice and soft for your ride, but when you have a bunch of luggage, you don't have that tendency to just blow through the stroke and bottom out easily. So when it comes to spring rate is basically the weight of the spring as far as how much weight it can support. And so you'll see different ratings. Sometimes they're in newtons per millimeter or kilograms per millimeter. Sometimes they're in pounds if you're looking at cars. And basically, let's say in the case of what that rate is, let's say it's kilograms per millimeter. If 1 millimeter of movement is going to yield that much force on a scale. So what that means to you is different weights of springs translates to different weights of riders or rider plus gear or bike plus rider plus gear. So a lighter person is going to have a lighter weight spring. A heavier person is probably going to have a heavier weight spring. Be realistic with what you are doing with the bike. So again, if you're going to run motocross, tell me it's a motocross bike. Don't tell me it's a woods bike. So again, these are all just factors to take into account. And that's the big thing when you are filling out the form is, be very honest. If you're honest with two people in your life, it's your doctor and your suspension guy. Typically we talk about sag. So there's rider sag and there's static sag. Static sag is when the bike is sitting on the ground, it's sitting under its own weight, and it's not on the kickstand or side stand, whatever you want to call it, and it's just standing there. It's how much does the bike basically sag under its own weight. And then the rider sag would be the bike standing straight up, not on its side stand, with the rider on it, fully geared up. These different measurements, based on years and years of everybody working on suspension, they've come up with these kind of predetermined rates.
This video is mostly based around my experience with adventure bikes because that's what I do the most, right? So these next couple of questions are going to be more adventure bike specific, but the basics still apply to any type of riding style. The biggest thing, as Paul said, is be honest with yourself about your actual skill and what type of riding you're going to be doing the most with the given bike you're going to be riding.
In the case of setting preload, a lot of the adventure bikes, like this is a Norden shock, have a preload adjuster knob. Smaller enduro bikes, maybe it's a threaded ring on the shock body itself. And so typically, like we talked about sag earlier, you want to check that. Static sag is easy because, again, it's the bike standing up on its own weight. You can do that yourself. Now, rider sag is a little trickier, so you may need a friend who can come over and help you balance on the bike and take that measurement. And the measurement in the case of rear sag is measured from the rear axle to some fixed point, basically straight up on the rear fender. This is a sag checking tool. This is made by Motion Pro, and it has this little cone piece. This is going to fit down in like the hole in the axle, and then depending on where your mark is on your fender, you can loosen that cone and kind of zero it out with the bike on the stand or center stand. And then once you set the bike on the ground, now you'll see that measurement, or when you're on the bike and your friend's measuring it for you, they'll see exactly where that is. When taking both static and rider sag, it's always a good idea to kind of bounce the bike a little bit, just to kind of make sure there's no stiction you're overcoming, and kind of get an average, because again, there will be a slight stiction zone in any situation. Compression and rebound. When you hear people talking about it, usually they're talking about clickers. Clickers are typically going to be the compression and the rebound at the bottom. Compression would be on the downstroke of the bike, so as the bike compresses under its own weight and the weight of us hefty riders. And then rebound is basically as the suspension unloads, how fast it comes out. In terms of your shock, this is a T7 shock. The compression adjuster here is what we would consider low speed compression. And now that's not speed of the bike itself, that is the shaft speed that we're measuring. So low speed compression is going to be the small undulations, your average riding, things like that. And then some shocks will also have an adjuster, usually it's concentric to this, that's your high speed. High speed is high shaft speed. So that could be, you know, you're rolling down the road and you hit a pothole, or you're hammering through, you know, some deep whoops, that sharp blow that the suspension takes when it starts to compress. And so adjusting those, you know, harder, softer can give you a different feel. So in the case of low speed compression, it might just feel kind of harsh, and you know, softening it a little bit just in your average riding, going through those bumps, you know, maybe it's easier on your wrists. The high speed compression adjustment, which again, not all shocks have, so like again, this T7 does not have a high speed compression adjuster. That can have an effect on how well the bike, again, handles those. So does it stay a little bit higher in the stroke? Does it stay a little bit lower in the stroke as it hits those? One of the things that can happen is if it blows through too quickly on those high speed hits, again, it feels mushy, it feels harsh. So just kind of setting it a little stiffer can be a good thing in that higher speed terrain. And then rebound, again, that's how fast this comes back out. Setting that too high or too low. Too high, the back, like for example, you're going down a washboardy road, it can just feel like it's just pogo stick basically. Too low, too slow, and what can happen is, and again, this would be more like in the case of successive hits, is it's not going to come out fast enough to keep the wheel on the ground, so it basically packs in, and so, you know, the bike may wind up squatting, and the front may do some weird things too. Or again, in the case of front forks, I recently had a set where my rebound was set way too low on basically a new setup I was running, and the front just would not maintain traction, and I kept washing out. I did just a couple clicks more of rebound, and instantly solved. While we're on the topic of rebound, a lot of people get confused on this one because it kind of feels backwards. So increasing the rebound, that's increasing the rebound dampening, which is technically slowing it down. So some people get that backwards, thinking increasing is speeding it up. But just think of it more in terms of dampening, of increasing dampening or decreasing dampening. Decreasing, basically, you're just letting it just slam out. Some of this may involve a little trial and error, mostly error, while you're setting up the bike. Typically when I set up a bike, I'll give you kind of a baseline setup and send you on your way. And whether it's, you know, feedback after the fact, or you call me while you're out riding, I'll walk you through you know, making adjustments, what you can do to improve the quality of your ride, because again, minor baseline settings, everybody's a little bit different from preference, how they ride, this and that, and you know, sometimes just talking through it in the garage, you can't get it dialed right away.
All right, so we've been out at EVO today. We've been talking suspension with a guy that actually knows what he's talking about versus me, who just sort of makes stuff up off of the fly, right? Any final thoughts about something you may want to add that we didn't cover already?
You know, one of the things we talked about performance, but one of the biggest things with performance, especially once you put some miles on your bike, is have your suspension serviced. That oil breaks down, and even if it's still inside there, it breaks down like your engine oil does, and it loses its lubricating characteristics. So, you know, it's important to flush, you know, any, you know, small particles that come off the pistons, and just replace that oil to preserve basically your components. I see shocks come in where all the coating is worn off on the inside because they brought me forks, but they didn't bring me a shock, and now you're replacing shock bodies or replacing entire shocks. So it's just important for the performance of your bike.
If you want to ride faster, fix your suspension and get it done right. Go to EVO Oregon, and I'll have the link for his website right down below, as well as a link in the description. Come see Paul, come talk to him, he'll get you set up. My name's Travis, this has been an Explore Adventure Moto production. Stay hairy.